pre-ordered a luxury meal, but you served everyone else except me. Can you explain why my order was missing?
Sir, I told you the system must have made an error. It wasn't on purpose.
I understand. I understand completely.
Ethan Harper sat in first class, a successful CEO used to comfort and luxury. He had already pre-ordered his meal, lobster bisque and filet mignon, exactly what he always chose. But when the flight attendant came back with a worried look, telling him they were out of his meal, something inside him broke. What should have been a normal flight turned into the start of something much bigger. In that moment, Ethan knew it wasn't a mistake. It was on purpose. The cold tone in her voice, the quick shrug, the way she handed him a simple sandwich and water while other passengers ate fancy food, he could feel it. He wasn't just another CEO. He wasn't just another passenger. He was the only black man in the cabin, and it hit him clearly. This wasn't about a meal. It was about being looked down on, dismissed, and ignored again. And Ethan Harper was not a man to let that go. What happened next would change everything for Stratus Air and send a message nobody would forget. Ethan, used to leading boardrooms and managing huge deals, never expected that his flight on Stratus Air 917 would become the place where change began. Dressed in a perfect navy suit and shiny shoes, he moved through first class with quiet confidence, the same confidence he had in every business deal. The smell of fresh linen and champagne filled the cabin, showing off the luxury Stratus Air bragged about. He settled into his seat, opened his tablet, and started working on the merger presentation for the next morning in Geneva. His mind was already planning the next step for his company in Europe. But something felt wrong. He could hear the soft murmurs of passengers and the low hum of the plane. Everything seemed normal, until the flight attendant came with the menu. He barely looked up. He had already pre-ordered his meal, like he always did, lobster bisque and filet mignon. It was more than food. It was a symbol of the respect he expected from companies like Stratus Air, who served their rich clients. He placed the order calmly and returned to his work. But this time, the response was different. The attendant rushed off too quickly, and he sensed something was wrong. Moments later, she returned, her smile tight. "I'm sorry, sir. We're out of the luxury meal options. You'll have to choose from the regular selection." Her voice was smooth, but something in it didn't feel right. Ethan blinked. "Out? I pre-ordered." She shrugged casually. "It must not have gone through. Happens sometimes." Then she walked away before he could say anything. His jaw tightened, but he stayed calm. What had just happened? For over 10 years, Ethan had flown with Stratus Air. Never had his pre-ordered meal been ignored, especially in first class. He looked at his tray, the small sandwich and lukewarm water mocking him, while other passengers, all white men in suits, were served caviar and champagne. It wasn't just a meal. It wasn't a mistake. The way the attendant acted, rushing off, offering no real apology, ignoring him, said everything. He had been overlooked, not just as a client, but as a person. He was the only black man on the plane, and now he felt it more than ever. He scanned the cabin. 6 men, all comfortable, drinking champagne and chatting. They hadn't noticed what had happened, and they never would. To them, it was a normal flight. But to Ethan, this was different. This wasn't a mistake, it was a pattern. He knew this kind of treatment before, the quiet racism, the unspoken ideas that he didn't belong, that he wasn't worthy of the same service. But Ethan was smart. He didn't act on impulse. He would respond calmly, quietly, but with power. For 10 minutes, his mind worked fast, full of quiet anger. He knew this wasn't a random error. Something had happened behind the scenes. He had been pushed aside, treated like he wasn't important. But Ethan didn't let that go unanswered. His phone buzzed. It was his assistant, Liam Brooks. "Everything okay?" the message read. Ethan didn't just sit there embarrassed. He wasn't going to let Stratus Air get away with it. He typed one sentence. Start internal audit. Flight 917. Cabin crew IDs needed. Confirm when ready. It wasn't about the meal anymore. It wasn't even about the attendant who had ignored him. This was about sending a message. He would show the company that ignoring and dismissing people had consequences. As the flight went on, Ethan stayed calm, expression unreadable. The attendants went about their work, unaware of what was happening. They were busy serving drinks and chatting with other passengers. But Ethan had already set his plan. By the time the plane landed in Geneva, everything would have changed. Liam Brooks, Ethan's sharp and attentive assistant, was already deep into the airline's employee records. His fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, pulling up the files of the flight attendants on board. He knew Ethan's request wasn't random. Everything had a purpose. As he scanned the records, he found what they suspected. The attendant who had ignored Ethan's meal had a long history of complaints. Rude behavior, discriminatory comments, even favoring certain passengers over others. This wasn't a one-time mistake. It was a system. In business, small acts of disrespect could create big problems. For Ethan, it wasn't about revenge. It was about exposing the truth, making the company face its culture, and making sure no one else would go through what he had. Ethan pressed the service button again, slowly and deliberately. An older flight attendant came over, her steps uncertain, as if she already felt the change in the air. Ethan wasn't the same man who had quietly ordered his meal earlier. He spoke calmly but firmly, looking her directly in the eye. I pre-ordered a luxury meal, Ethan said, his tone clear. And yet I've been given something else. You mentioned prioritizing certain guests. Can you explain that? The attendant stammered, unable to answer before Ethan cut her off. I understand, he said. His words were calm, but every one was deliberate. I understand completely. The plane was preparing to land in Geneva, but Ethan was already several steps ahead. His next move would be decisive, and the results would be undeniable. It was no longer about him or the flight attendants. It was about making sure a company that boasted about luxury truly understood respect. Meanwhile, Liam was organizing everything on the ground. By the time the plane touched down, the audit was ready, the video evidence sent, and the CEO of Stratus Air informed. The quiet trap was already set, designed to reveal years of subtle bias and unfair treatment. When the plane landed, two sharply dressed airline officials waited at the gate. Ethan walked past them without a word. His plan was in motion. The crew had no idea what was coming. They believed everything was normal, thinking this would be just another flight. But they were about to learn that small acts of discrimination had consequences they could not escape. The cabin crew disembarked as usual, unaware of the change that had begun. But waiting for them were HR officers and security. This wasn't a public scene, no shouting or drama. It was quiet, precise, and complete. Their careers, built over years, were now under review. Every little action, the dismissive smiles, the favoritism, the ignored complaints, was exposed. The flight attendant who had refused Ethan's meal was escorted away calmly. Her employment record was frozen. Every act of subtle disrespect she had committed was now part of an official review. It wasn't about punishment for the sake of punishment. It was about sending a clear message. Nobody, regardless of their rank or color, should ever be treated as less than anyone else. By the time Stratus Air's leadership realized what had happened, the change was already underway. It wasn't loud protests or angry complaints. It was a calculated, quiet strike that forced the company to see the flaws in its culture and service. Ethan hadn't just held the crew accountable. He had started a shift in the values of the entire company. Respect and equality were not optional. They were essential. The crew didn't just lose their jobs. They lost the privilege of thinking they could treat people like they didn't matter. Ethan watched everything calmly. There was no need for confrontation. There was no need for drama. The change had begun the moment he decided not to ignore what had happened on that flight. The system that had allowed dismissive behavior for years had been exposed, and the message was clear. Disrespect has consequences, and no one is untouchable. Even as the plane emptied and normal passengers filed out, the ripple of what had happened behind the scenes was already moving through the company. Stratus Air would never look the same again. The quiet power of a single man, seated in 1A, had turned a moment of humiliation into a lesson of accountability and justice. The flight attendants, still unaware of what was happening, moved toward the exit as if nothing had changed. They believed their usual routine would continue, that no one would notice their small acts of discrimination and dismissiveness. But the moment they stepped off the plane, everything changed. HR officers and security were there, ready to enforce the consequences of years of ignored complaints. Ethan stood nearby, calm and composed. He didn't need to shout or create a scene. The evidence, the audit, the video recordings, all of it had already done the work. The quiet power of preparation and strategy was enough. The crew would now understand that their actions had weight, that their careless behavior could no longer be hidden behind routine or luxury branding. As the officers quietly escorted the crew away, their careers hung in the balance. No dramatic confrontation was needed. The crew members who had underestimated Ethan had not realized the importance of respect and equality. They now faced the results of their repeated mistakes, the subtle favoritism and dismissive attitudes that had gone unchecked for too long. It was a moment of reckoning, not just for them, but for the company as a whole. Ethan reflected on the flight as he walked toward the exit. What had started as a denied meal, a small act of disrespect, had turned into a movement for accountability. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about creating humiliation. It was about exposing the truth, ensuring that no person, regardless of race or status, would ever be treated as less than anyone else. Every detail, every act, had been carefully recorded and acted upon. The message was simple and clear. Respect is not negotiable. Stratus Air's leadership would soon see the full impact. Emails, reports, and video evidence had already been delivered. The audit had highlighted systemic issues in the company's culture, showing that small acts of dismissiveness were not isolated but part of a larger problem. Ethan's actions had forced the company to confront what they had long ignored. They had no choice but to make meaningful changes to how they treated passengers and staff alike. For Ethan, the satisfaction was quiet but deep. He had taken a moment of personal offense and turned it into a catalyst for change. The flight attendants who had once believed they could treat anyone with less respect had now faced real consequences. They would remember the lesson for the rest of their lives, and so would the company. Stratus Air would never again be able to ignore the importance of fairness, equality, and true respect. It was a reminder that even small acts of injustice, if ignored, could grow into patterns. But with strategy, calm, and focus, a single person could bring about significant change. Ethan Harper had done exactly that. He had turned a personal slight into a corporate lesson, showing that preparation and patience could outmatch ignorance and bias. By the time the passengers disembarked, life seemed normal on the surface. Drinks were still served, announcements were still made, and luggage was still collected. But beneath the calm exterior, a powerful message had been delivered. The quiet but decisive actions of one man had transformed the culture of an entire airline. Ethan walked through the terminal, thoughtful but unshaken. The flight had started with a small denial, a missed meal, but it had ended with far more than that. It had ended with accountability, respect, and justice. Stratus Air would remember this day. The crew would remember it. And anyone paying attention would see that the value of a person is never to be underestimated. As he left the airport, Ethan felt a deep sense of completion. No words were needed. The message had been sent. The change had begun. For Stratus Air, the lesson was clear. Every passenger, every person, deserves respect. and if anyone thought otherwise, the consequences would be unavoidable. The cabin crew, once so confident in their routine, now faced the reality of their choices. They hadn't lost their jobs in a dramatic public fight. They had lost them quietly, efficiently, and undeniably. It was a statement that would echo through the company for years. Ethan Harper had transformed a personal slight into a systemic wake-up call. By the time news of the audit reached the higher executives, the impact had already taken hold. They couldn't deny the patterns revealed, the evidence collected, or the accountability enforced. What had begun as a small moment of disrespect on a single flight had grown into a turning point for the company. And as for Ethan, he returned to his life, knowing that he had not only defended his own dignity, but had sparked meaningful change. The flight that could have been just another routine trip had become a catalyst for justice, proving that respect and equality are non-negotiable values. The crew, the company, and the passengers had all witnessed the quiet power of one person who refused to be ignored. It was a lesson that would not be forgotten. One small denial had created a lasting transformation, and Ethan Harper's calm, strategic approach had shown that real change does not always need drama. It needs clarity, focus, and courage. The quiet revolution had begun, all from seat 1A.